Hello and welcome to another quick video on a recurring topic, this time class interest. So grab your copy of the Communist Manifesto, we have nothing to lose but our chains, comrades. Let's talk about class. Wikipedia has the following line, which summarises the gist of Marx's concept of class, which is as much as we need to just get this conversation started. Marx distinguishes one class from another on the basis of two criteria: ownership of the means of production and control of the labour power of others. Class is thus determined by property relations, not by income or status. So Marx's views on class relate to the means of production and the differences between those who own them and those who are exploited by those same people. So for example, the worker wants higher wages and better working conditions, and the business owner wants the opposite of these things in order to extract as much profit as possible. You can see my short explainer on the profit motive in a link here. However, where does social status come into this? Does that not also influence the behaviour of people and groups? I have no idea how you're supposed to say the next website's name, so let's go with pedia.com, who did a nice sort of summation of the difference between Marx's thoughts on class and the idea of social standing or status. Yes. Either way. The main difference between social status and social class is that social status is based on one's factors like family, descent, honour and prestige of an occupation and position in society, while social class is based on socio-economic factors. They do have a snazzy little graphic, which I'll pop up here somewhere. Now, in a country that devotes as much thought and deference to its history and institutions as the UK, social status still plays a big part in how parts of society organise themselves, and I do think it's important we include it in our thoughts about class more generally. When we are talking about class interest, whether we are considering the material conditions of Marx's definition or the social and psychological implications of a more social status, we are essentially discussing the same dynamic. That being that within society there will be groups of people with shared goals or indeed interests, and these groups can be expected to act in accordance with those shared interests. Does that make sense? Well, let's put it in some context. Way back in the time before, in the sunlit uplands of optimism that was 2017, you may remember a slogan that said, "For the many, not the few," which was in essence a distillation, a word I use too much, I know, of the principle of class interest, namely that the vast majority of the country would benefit from the same group of policies, since so many of us share the same interests. What was clever about slogans like "For the many, not the few" and "We are the 99%" is that it broke up class relations into a broad and simple collection of interests that allowed people to identify their place in what was a simple binary choice. Does your income come from the exploitation of owned assets or not? You can theoretically apply any number of classes to society by breaking up interests into smaller and more precise categories, such as in sociology, where they would normally categorise social class into about 5 different categories. And this may be useful in terms of understanding society in more detail. But when we are talking about leveraging class interests for the improvement of the majority, we generally need to resist the urge to split into smaller and smaller groupings. For example, in the UK, it can be said that the vast majority of people would have their lives improved by lower rents and mortgage payments, higher incomes and better funded public services, and these could be considered a shared or class interest. However, there is a much smaller collection of people who own those homes, businesses and privatised public services who would want the opposite of all those things to ensure they were able to leverage the maximum amount of profit from those businesses. This is the profit motive in action. Again, see video before if you're not sure on that. This smaller group has a disproportionate share of the wealth, power and influence, and has contradictory class interests to the majority. So it is to their own advantage to ensure that circumstances aren't allowed to change, and so they will position themselves in order to do just that. They will act in their class interest. So let's talk about that. The reason we talk about class interest is so that we can understand the many contradictions within our society. The contradiction of the workplace, for example, where we have the owners driven by the profit motive to reduce costs and exploit every possible resource for the maximum profit. And then we have the workers, who need a decent wage and working conditions. There are more workers than owners, but the owners hold the wealth and the decision-making power. Unions were formed to provide an organised force that could rebalance the power dynamic within a workplace and provide a platform for workers' shared interests. Looking across at another institution, the UK media is an example where understanding class interest allows us to understand why The media picks the stories it does, the journalists it hires, and why so many billionaires are happy to take on a loss-making paper. What we've got here is a little snippet from Full Fact, talking about journalism. 51% of journalists were public school educated compared to 7% of the total population. Followed by another little piece from Wikipedia. According to a 2021 report by the Media Reform Coalition, 90% of the UK-wide print media is owned and controlled by just 3 companies: Reach plc, News UK and DMG Media. Protecting their class through the use of propaganda, and by extension taking control of the Overton window, is a means of fighting to maintain a situation that benefits the ownership class and their shared interest. So what about the government? 29% of MPs were independently educated, which is compared to 7% of the general population. If you look at a graph of what are considered working class MPs in Britain, we've gone from just under 40% in 1965, for Labour that is, down to about 9% at 2010. If you look into the number of privately educated people in these industries, the number with wealthy or comfortable family upbringings, and the amount of nepotism that goes on, it quickly becomes very clear how the inequality is maintained. Taking this from the consistently brilliant Mick Wright, Henry Deeds is the son of Jeremy Deeds, the former chief executive of the Daily Telegraph. And Jeremy Deeds, who no doubt climbed his way up the most greasy pole at the Daily Telegraph, is the son of Lord Deeds, who both edited the Daily Telegraph and secured a ministerial role in the Thatcher administration while still managing to clock up nearly 60 years in association with the Telegraph as a columnist and leader writer. Class interest instructs us on how groups of people may behave when they have to make a choice. They also show us how to understand why a government populated by people with different class interests from ourselves are unlikely to ever create a scenario against their own interests, even if that might be the morally right thing to do. We can then extrapolate this into why the media all seems to lean to the right and favour capitalist exploitation, colonialism, the royal family over union activity and socialism, for example. However, we must also be vigilant to not become attached to rigid ideas of class that do not change. The traditional idea of the working class, for example, does not tend to include those beyond male-dominated manual jobs and trades, so it can omit office workers, carers, cleaners, precarious workers, as well as all those doing unpaid labour and those unable to work, even though all these people have shared interests. It is understanding class via these shared interests that allows us to avoid falling into rigid traps and old definitions. Most importantly, the next time you hear a policy being floated or a controversial media piece doing the rounds on social media, just make sure you ask yourself, in whose interest does this act? Whose interest does this serve? You'll be surprised how much clearer the world becomes once you do. Thanks for listening to this quick video. I hope this has been helpful. Please give the video a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content. Hopefully I'll see you again soon. Bye!